butterfly collecting. Yet Levi-Strauss's plan for drawing up an inventory of all human societies, past and present, with a view to establishing their complementarities and differences, is surely the closest thing to butterfly collecting ever encountered in the annals of anthropology. And unsurprisingly, the plan came to nothing. Now, I'm not pretending that Radcliffe-Brown's approach was without contradictions of its own. On the contrary, it was mired in contradiction from the start. Much has been made of Radcliffe-Brown's debt to the sociology of Durkheim. And for Durkheim, of course, societies were self-contained entities, each with its own individuality, which could nevertheless be grouped into species on the grounds of the limited number of possible working combinations of their constituent parts. But where Levi-Strauss took this principle of discontinuity to its logical extreme, Radcliffe-Brown, who was influenced as much by Whitehead's philosophy of organism as by Durkheim's sociology, moved in the opposite direction to re-establish the principle of continuity. Now, this attempt to refract the process ontology of Whitehead through the classificatory epistemology of Durkheim, though brave, was bound to fail. Inevitably, social life reappeared as the life of society, emergent form as pre-existent structure, the continuity of history as the alternation of stability and change. And indeed, there was no way in which Durkheim's first rule of sociological method, to consider social facts as things, could be squared with Radcliffe-Brown's idea of social life as a continuous and irreversible process. Nevertheless, I have found more inspiration in this idea of the social as a life process than in all the criticisms that have been levelled against it put together. Divested of the dead weight of Durkheim's sociologism, I think it's an idea that we can and should take forward from Radcliffe-Brown in forging a conception better suited to our times of what a genuinely open-ended and comparative anthropology could be. Quite simply, it would be an inquiry into the conditions and possibilities of social life at all times and everywhere. And to explain what I mean by this, I need to be more precise about the significance of both of my key terms, social and life. In a series of seminars presented at the University of Chicago in 1937 and subsequently transcribed and published under the title A Natural Science of Society, Radcliffe-Brown dwelt at some length on the distinction between social science and psychology. And the matter for him was absolutely clear-cut. Psychology studies the mind, and the mind is a system of relations between states internal to the individual actor. Their relations, so to speak, under the skin. Social science, however, deals with relations between individuals, not within them. The moment you get outside the skin of the individual, Radcliffe-Brown declared, you have no longer psychological but social relations. Now, the deep-seated assumption that mind is an internal property of human individuals that can be studied in isolation from their involvement with one another or with the wider environment continues to reverberate within the field of psychology, but it has been widely challenged. And one of the first to issue such a challenge was the great pioneer of psychological anthropology, A. Irving Hallowell. In an extraordinarily prophetic paper on the self and its behavioral environment published in 1954, Hallowell concluded that no physical barrier can come between mind and world. Any inner-outer dichotomy, he maintained, with the human skin as boundary is psychologically irrelevant. 15 years later, Gregory Bateson made exactly the same point. Mind, Bateson insisted, is not confined within individual bodies as against a world out there, but is immanent in the entire system of organism-environment relations within which all human beings are necessarily enmeshed. The mental world, as he put it, is not limited by the skin, but rather reaches out into the environment along the multiple and ever-extending sensory pathways of the human organism's involvement in its surroundings. Now, I invoke the word social to signify this understanding of the essential interpenetrability or commingling of mind and world. So far from serving to demarcate a particular domain of phenomena, as opposed, say, to the biological or the psychological, I take the word to denote a certain ontology, an understanding of the constitution of the phenomenal world itself. And as such, It is opposed to an ontology of the particulate that imagines a world of individual entities and events, each of which is linked through an external contact, whether of spatial contiguity or temporal succession, that leaves its basic nature unaffected. Or in the terms of the physicist David Bohm, the order of such an imagined world would be explicit. By contrast, the order of the social world is implicate. That is to say, any particular phenomenon on which we might choose to focus our attention enfolds within its constitution the totality of relations of which, in their unfolding, it is the momentary outcome. Were we to cut these relations and seek to recover the whole from its now isolated fragments, something would be lost which could never be recovered. And that something is life itself. As the biologist Paul Weiss put it in a 1969 symposium on the future of the life sciences, the mere reversal of our prior analytic dissection of the universe by putting the pieces together again can yield no complete explanation of even the most elementary living system. And that's why, to return to my earlier criticism of Leach, a mechanical analogy can offer no account of social life. A machine can be constructed from parts, but machines don't live. And this brings me from the meaning of the social to the second of my key terms, namely life. By this I don't mean an internal animating substance that is installed in some things but not others, distinguishing the former as members of the class of animate objects. Life, as Weiss observed, is process, not substance. And this process is tantamount to the unfolding of a continuous and ever-unfolding field of relations within which beings of all kinds are generated and held in place. Thus, where Radcliffe-Brown drew a parallel between organic life and social life, I draw an identity. Organic life is social, and so for that matter is the life of the mind, because the order to which it gives rise is implicate. Now, I hope you'll see in this distinction between the explicate and implicate orders an echo of the contrast I drew earlier between theoretical and descriptive modes of integration. To recapitulate, the theoretical mode works through the summation of discrete particulars according to the sigma principle, so as to arrive at covering statements of the general form of social relations. The descriptive mode, on the other hand, seeks to apprehend the relational coherence of the world itself as it is given to immediate experience, by homing in on particulars, each of which brings to a focus and momentarily condenses the very processes that brought it into being. And although both modes of integration aspire to a kind of holism, their respective understandings of totality are very different. The first is a totality of form. It implies the closure and completion of a system of relations that has been fully joined up. But the second is a totality of process, which, since it is forever ongoing, is always open-ended and never complete, but which nevertheless encapsulates in every moment, which is nevertheless encapsulated in every moment that it brings forth. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, I'm not convinced that the terms theoretical and descriptive are entirely appropriate for these two approaches, and I'd like to explain why. The reason is that the very notion of description as a task that is somehow opposed to the project of theory has its roots in the first of the two modes. It harks directly back to Radcliffe-Brown's division between ethnography and anthropology, respectively ideographic and nomothetic, descriptive and theoretical. And yet, in the opposition between descriptive data and theoretical generalization, the act of description is itself diminished, reduced to a mechanical function of information pickup. The second mode, on the other hand, refuses this reduction, recognizing, as the first does not, that any act of description entails a movement of interpretation. What is given to experience in this mode comprises not individual data, but the world itself. It's a world that is not so much mapped out as taken in from a particular vantage point, much as the painter takes in the landscape that surrounds him or her from the position at which he has planted his easel. It follows that any endeavor of so-called descriptive integration, if it is to do justice to the implicate order of social life, can be neither descriptive nor theoretical in the specific senses constituted by their opposition. It must rather do away with the opposition itself. So, what then And at this point, as I was writing this lecture, I